Welcome to the Lowdown on the Plus Up, a Boardwalk Times podcast. This is your old pal Kelly here to give you the lowdown on this particular lowdown. For this one episode, we've walked away from our usual format in order to devote an hour to speak to Ken Bruce, the author of Before the Birds Sang Words, a riveting and absolutely indispensable book about the history of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room and the development of Disneyland. We hope you enjoy this week's special lowdown on the Plus Up. We'll be back to our regular format in our next episode. See you real soon. So, Pete, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're doing something that we haven't done before. We have a special guest, but before we introduce this gentleman, I'll talk about what our subject is. Our subject is the world-famous, fabulous Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. We finally got there.
Enchanted Tiki Room. Yep. Yeah, and I suspect the Enchanted Tiki Room is going to be one of those things that, much like the Jungle Cruise or the Haunted Mansion or any of these sort of epic legacy attractions, is going to be something that will come back again and again and again. But we are so incredibly lucky tonight to have someone who's probably, at this point, the foremost expert on the Enchanted Tiki Room. He is the author of Before the Birds Sang Words. He is our friend Ken Bruce.
Hey, Ken. Hello. Welcome.
Yay. Thank you so much. I've been poking around at the perimeters of your site for quite a while, so it's really lovely to be invited to this party for sure. Thank you so much, Kelly and Peter. I'm happy, thrilled to be here.
Thank you, Ken. Now, I have to warn you, because this has come up a few times as I was sort of doing a little bit of research and stuff for this episode. Ken Burns, the famous documentary filmmaker, went to my alma mater, and so I hear his name all the time.
Yeah.
So if I start asking you questions about the Civil War or the history of baseball, just, set me right.
Oh, I will answer those questions beautifully.
Okay.
You just cut to me. I'll be the old Southern gentleman guy. Well, they came over on the side of West. Yeah, exactly.
And I'll share additional stuff about the Brooklyn Bridge and jazz and
please do.
Nuts.
What do you know about Eleanor Roosevelt?
Exactly.
Oh, I think I might have gotten a spit take out of Pete, which has been a while. So banner day for me. So we're recording today when there's a lot going on in Southern California, and I kind of want to acknowledge it. There's some horrific fires going on down there, and before we started recording, Ken and us were talking, and luckily he's safe.
Yes.
Where he is.
I'm still not turned into cinder yet.
Yes. Thank heavens.
Eventually, maybe, but at the moment, no, we're good.
Okay.
Well, that's definitely where I'm ending up. I'm hoping to have a few more years before I get there. Yeah. My wife wants to do this thing where she gets wrapped in mushrooms and buried. I guess That's a real thing. I'm intrigued.
We just went dark.
Yeah, we.
Too much right now.
Maybe.
I don't know. But I thought, what would be interesting. I definitely want to spend most of the time talking about your book because it's an incredible book.
Thank you, Kelly.
In fact, I'll lead up to it by saying when I first saw it kind of popping up in feeds here and there, I thought, I'm definitely going to get to this book. But I'm not sure how deep into tiki culture I want to dive right now. I'd been to an Adventureland day down at Disneyland, and ever since I get a text every single day about a new tiki mug I can buy. It was really getting to me. I've been sober for like 10 years, so
good for you.
Thank you. That whole culture is a little bit foreign to me at this point. And then I reached out to you, Ken, with a question that I think really irritated you.
Doubt it. Absolutely not.
But you were so kind in humoring me, persistently asking you about Imagineer Lee Adams.
Yeah. Yes.
And eventually you said, you're just going to have to buy my book. And I did. And I got it, and I could not put the thing down. It was the first thing about theme parks at all that I had read in a long time where I would literally put the book down and look over at my wife and go, no way.
Yeah.
So I love the book, and I want to
very sweet.
But before we get to it, since all this stuff's going on in Southern California, I thought it might be interesting to ask, what is Ken Bruce's Southern California like? What do you love down in LA or Santa Monica or wherever you spend time down there? Because Pete and I are fascinated with LA.
I didn't choose to live here. It chose me because my parents, had me in Torrance, California, which is near Palos Verdes, San Pedro, Long Beach. I mean, I certainly know the places that I go to, but, there's an LA mythology that is in the movies and it's in TV, but it's not necessarily a reflection of the people that actually live here. And I was talking about a friend that I have who came here from Auckland, and of course he immediately gets a red convertible and drives around, down the streets of Hollywood. This is the LA culture, and I'm going to play it out. And I promise you, if you see someone like that on the road, they are not from LA. We're a little bit more, I don't know, not that fabulous. I grew up by the beach, and I never went to the beach. So it's not quite. LA is large. It's full of many different people and many different cultures. And then perhaps that is one of the reasons it's so great. There's so much different food and energy and culture, and it's a progressive area. So, everybody's going to let you can let your freak flag fly. Growing up here too, it was Disneyland. So, when I got to Disneyland, I was age 5, and that, if you grow up here, Disneyland for so many people becomes a touchstone. Certainly was for me, and of course the movie industry. So that's the stuff that I align with most. I moved to Iowa for a couple of years to do a job of all places, which was a different culture altogether. But one of the first things you realize is people don't talk movies over in Iowa the way they talk movies over here. Movies or media, and that's my world, where we talk about the latest movie and or piece of theater or whatever. So that I love.
It's a great answer. And I find that, we're up in Northern California. We're just a little bit north of San Francisco. And we think we're very multicultural. And in some ways we are, but it doesn't blend here the same way it does down around LA. It's I don't even know how to describe it. Like you really can walk block to block and experience radically different culture after radically different culture, and it's
I think
it's very
that's
beautiful.
Part of it, Kelly, is that draws a lot of people to LA is that you can find your tribe. Finding your tribe is not easy everywhere you go, but here you're going to find your people one way or another. You will find them,
right?
And once you do, it's absolutely validating.
So, how and Pete, jump in with anything. I have a couple of notes here, but any?
No, it's okay. Let us proceed. I mean, because just to kind of give you an idea about my background, Ken, is I kind of grew up between both Northern California and Southern California. I couldn't pick between the Dodgers or the Giants. I had to pick the Yankees because I couldn't. Because a lot of my family came from either Anaheim or they came from Northridge, and the Panorama City, that little range. I mean, my parents were from that area, and then another section was from Anaheim, and so I would spend a good deal, almost like a third of my year down in LA. So I'm kind of this weird mix of a Northern California and a Southern. Like you say the word Tom Hatton to me and I go, yay. I know exactly. I grew up with all these little things that kids from LA grew up with that not a lot of Northern Californians would get. And so for me, as a valley kid, basically, who'd come and visit enough to basically know the culture and know enough people, for me, we would be going to like Fairfax Avenue and hanging out with all of our Jewish friends. My grandparents knew a bunch of old Borscht Belt comedians that would write for shows, and they would hang out at, Brent's.
Cantors.
Yeah, Cantors. Yeah, they would totally hang out there, and we would be running all over the place. And then I also, in 81, we adopted. My grandparents did something really remarkable during the Iranian hostage crisis. They actually took in a bunch of refugees from Iran. And I actually wound up getting an auntie from Iran. And so over time, she would start introducing me to the huge Iranian population in that area. Yeah. So, that melting it's not a melting pot. It's really like a tapestry. And it's really interesting once you find your tribes, and whether it's the underground comic scene or whether it's the lowbrow art scene here. Like at Wacko. It's all there. It's just amazing.
It's all there. Absolutely. Yeah. I was struck by my niece and nephews, who are like my kids, are half Persian descent. Their mother is of Persian descent. And I was walking through my neighborhood, saw a Persian restaurant, and they were like, "Ken, we need to take you to a Persian restaurant that we know of." And they took me to a place, I don't know, kind of near Santa Monica, Westwood. And it was an entire several blocks of just Persian, I'm not going to say immigrants, but Persian descendants. And I didn't know, all the food there and the ice cream. And I didn't even, So and I'm naive. Like there's, you think of Chinatown and Japantown and Thai town, but an area of Persian food, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you're constantly discovering that all the time.
And I think there's a mentality too where there is, and I'm going to go for our segue here.
Here we go.
The Los Angelino culture of adopting different cultures and embracing it, sometimes to a point of excess, especially in the 50s and the 60s. Kelly and I have talked in the past about Walt's. There's 3 stages of Walt. There's the first stage, which lasts pretty much up to Snow White, where we call him the huckster. And he could convince anybody. He could convince you out of your shirt. And then there's this very short space.
And he did a number of times.
Oh, yeah. Just ask Dubai Works. But then there's another section in which there's Walt, the auteur, which everybody lauded him as this great artist, along with like Salvador Dali. And this is during Snow White. And he was in some ways. He was very good at assembling groups of people. And then there's Uncle Walt, right? But we talk about how he embraced stuff, and it just gets awkward at times. And then it actually kind of settles into something that people find a little bit more palatable, even if it's still a little tricky. But it's not out of cruelty that this embracing of different cultures, and in this case, with our subject matter, Polynesian culture, it becomes this true embracing of it, and in a way where they're really trying to be heartfelt, like, this is great stuff, but it's still a little awkward. So, but you would never get that type of embracing of a culture from, say, entertainers from Northern California, with the exception of guys like Trader Vic, who had started the Trader Vic's restaurant chain up in Emeryville, and then eventually moved to. It started in Oakland and eventually moved to Emeryville. But very few people would be doing that. It was very much more insular up here in Northern California. So it's interesting that that's the kind of mentality of the people from that area kind of spawns this pursuit.
It certainly wasn't Walt. I know that when I wrote my book, I had to discuss a little bit about the prickly subject of cultural appropriation and dig into that, because some people consider it problematic. And the more I dug, the more I actually started to side with the maybe the not so progressive way of looking at it, quite frankly. The tiki pop movement is so specifically American, and it is built on so many different cultures. Cultural appropriation isn't necessarily a bad thing too. We do it without even thinking. It's all about whether you're doing it out of respect or you're doing it because you love the culture. We have the Greek gods, we have the Roman gods. They're the same, but one took from the other because it was a great idea.
Well, the very word appropriation, it's from French, and we're using it as an English term. So let's just, you know.
You can't listen to any bit of classical music that isn't cultural appropriation. But so the tiki culture is uniquely American. And it is born out of a profound love and excitement for not just Polynesian culture, anything exotic, anything otherworldly. It doesn't come from I'm making fun of it. It comes from I love it for many different reasons. So because it is, you know, the rum is Cuban and the music is what Latin American and the food is Cantonese and the tikis are cartoon versions of several different ideas. It's its own thing. And
the ukuleles came from the Philippines originally.
Well, I have no problem with any of it. I was expecting I might. I don't. And it's so funny because so many people who there are plenty of Polynesians who are like, I don't have a problem with it so long as you just. It comes from a place of respect.
There's some stuff that you talk about in the book that I found honestly surprising that came across as actually quite progressive for the time. And specifically, I'm thinking about the use of the lyrics from the original version of the Hawaiian War Chant.
Right. Yeah, the Hawaiian War Chant is nothing but cultural appropriation because it's actually taking a love ballad. That is 100% Polynesian and turning it into the Hawaiian War Chant, which is kind of a zany, jazz-infused number, which is a lot of fun, where we put English lyrics on it. And when it was going to be used for the Enchanted Tiki room, it was it started wordless, but then they did put in the Ralph Freed English lyrics in it. And then over time, they just slowly weeded it out because one section was just harmonizing without lyrics. And then very late in the game, the composer, George Bruns, or the arranger, thought, this sounds really good as just the actual lyrics of the love ballad, which makes it a little weird because it's called the Hawaiian War Chant, and actually,
but it's a love ballad.
They're actually singing the love ballad, and then of course they throw in the chanting, which is actually taking the lyrics of the love ballad for brief sections, and doing it in a really angry tone, which is nuts. I equate it with singing Once Upon a Dream, as if you were while like hammering spikes into a rail,
like you're trying to intimidate your rugby opponent.
It does not make any sense. Yeah, you do not intimidate anybody by singing "Once Upon a Dream" like you're angry.
I'm also imagining hi ho, but it's done as a haka. I don't,
Yeah, exactly. But ultimately, my point ultimately is that in a way it was kind of progressive because it was George Bruns going, we don't need the original. We don't need the Ralph Freed lyrics because it sounds so beautiful in Hawaiian. No one he understood is going to understand what they're saying. So nobody would have back in 1963, heard a love ballad. They just hear this beautiful melody and the Polynesian language. So bit of unexpectedly ahead of its time.
And the original lyrics, they were by Hawaiian royalty. Can you remind me who?
Oh God, I can't.
It's your book,
and
Ben.
I don't want to. It's going to happen. In fact, I knew right as I finished the book. It's like I'm going to be doing speaking engagements, and people are going to ask me questions, and I'll be like, I wrote it down. But once Kelly, you write a book, and I promise you, the moment you write it down, you forget it.
It's gone.
But it was royalty.
It's a prince, I believe.
I want to say princess, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
And it was, a simple ballad about two lovers,
Yeah.
in a fern, a fern garden, embracing.
Mm-hmm.
And absolutely pretty. And then we came along and called it the Hawaiian War Chant. Had nothing. Nothing
Turned
to do
it into
with
a
the war.
Spike Jones style,
exactly.
novelty hit.
On the island of Lulu. Spectacular.
Ul. Yeah.
Exactly.
So the book, it covers so much ground. So we have the history of tiki culture in America, which was way more interesting than I expected it to be.
It is, yeah.
It really is. It certainly has the history of this specific attraction, which the number of revisions this thing went through, and the number of times that Walt seemed to walk into an almost fully fledged attraction and go, nah, and restart it is astonishing.
Because I'm going to say absolutely. Like the fun of one of the things that was so fun about writing this story is how Walt was. It's incredibly personal attraction to Walt. I mean, Walt had his hands all over it. Kind of his idea from start to finish, but how it was Walt making this thing up as he went. It was evolving. Almost everything Walt starts with keeps growing and growing and growing and getting more daffy and crazy and bigger and more audacious. And this was just that sort of thing. Walt's sensibility is all over it because, again, he had everything to do with it. It was his money. He was paying for it. Literally his money, right out of his pocketbook. And yeah, when you break down the timeline like I did over so many years and you start to put the pieces together, you realize this was Walt building it from the ground up.
Yeah.
Nothing but things coming together in a random, crazy way, and how it changed constantly, and yet it was always evolving and getting more ridiculous and daffy as it went. Not just that, not just in tone, but in tech. Yeah, I'm going to bring up that word again. It is the most, just from a technological standpoint, it is the most consequential attraction at Disneyland. It changed everything. Not just with animatronics, but the very tone of the show, the very magic and enchantment of it. It kind of, there was Disneyland before, which was, to today's perspective, not very interesting park, not as revolutionary as we give it credit for. But once the Enchanted Tiki Room lands, Disneyland knows what it is. Absolutely knows what it is. We are here to spellbind you. We're here. We can infuse joy, enchantment, magic. It's one giant magic trick after another. We know what this park is about. Yeah, there were a few other things too, but really, it's like pre Tiki Room and post, and Disneyland now has wings and is flying to what we really know today.
Yeah, I think I think I'm probably the oldest guy in the virtual room here by a little bit. And if you were to ask me as a kid what represented Disneyland, I think it's very likely that I would have said the Enchanted Tiki Room. That I might have said Adventures Through Inner Space, but I was a weird kid.
Which was doing a lot with a little. Yeah. We have to remember, too, before the Tiki Room, there was no Pirates of the Caribbean or Haunted Mansion or Small World, or, it was a handful of dark rides, and the major attraction was Jungle Cruise, which was still constantly evolving, does to this day. The submarine ride was there, Matterhorn was there, but it changed everything.
Nothing that came alive in that way.
Yeah. Well, and also that's when Imagineering really, really took a toehold in understanding the value of surprising an audience. We take that for granted, but the idea of actually how can we do this thing where the audience just absolutely didn't see that coming, whatever it happens to be. A room stretching. I just went down a waterfall and then went back up. How many in the later attractions were they able to pull off with great, great effort? Maybe 2 or 3. But the Enchanted Tiki Room, count them, has 10, for 1963 audiences, 10 bona fide, holy cow, didn't see that coming moments. And that is incredibly hard to pull off. And that became Imagineering's North Star ever since. We strive to create magic is the word you hear constantly when you're at the park. It's like, stop already. But it was well earned with something like the Enchanted Tiki Room because people just didn't know how they pulled that off. Right down to expecting when they left the Tiki Room that the ground would be wet because there was a rainstorm out there. It
was a storm, right?
We giggle now, but people were able to suspend their disbelief in ways that we cynical people today don't do so well. But my bigger point is how difficult that is to pull off, and holy cow, they did it.
Yeah. And I do think you're right. I think it's much tougher now because we are a bit more cynical and we know a little too much. However, I will tell you that the first time that I took my kid into the Enchanted Tiki Room, they thought a storm had happened. I mean, they believed it absolutely. And I mean, they were like 7, but but still.
At least you didn't do what I did, Kelly, which was follow my kid afterwards. And I had a cup of water and I was like sprinkling her behind her. Just, I'm all about the immersion.
Evil.
Maynard was very angry. Let's put it that way. So
Maynard was angry. We were talking about like kind of Walt revising the attraction over and over again. I got a real sense from your book kind of how Walt worked. And I've read this sort of thing about him before. Walt has pluses and minuses.
He's a human being.
He's a human being.
The rest of us,
But I think what's really interesting, and you get this
endlessly grumpy. You had to be careful around him.
Endlessly grumpy, and it wasn't very flowing with the compliments. Tended to have his
Kelly. He did not give compliments. At all.
No. I think I heard someone, and it might have been Rolly Crump, saying that he heard him once say, "Good enough," and then walked out, and I was like, "That's the most."
That'll do.
Yeah. But I love this sense of he probably didn't really know what he was going for. He just knew that it kind of hadn't gotten there yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I think with the Tiki Room, it was a series of discoveries for Walt, where his people proved that they could do X, Y, or Z. And once they did, he was like, well, if you can do that, can you do this? And they would be like, let's go for it. So he was, it started as such a small little idea. This needs to be underlined about 100 times. The Tiki Room started as, it was just going to be a cafe.
Yeah.
An intimate little cafe, then became a restaurant later. But it started as just the idea was, okay, Lillian can finally have her tea room, quite frankly. It was going to go on Main Street, but they never got around to it. So Walt was like, oh, we can do a Tahitian style cafe of some sort.
Right.
So what's my point? So it starts from that. And then John Hench just inadvertently for fun, probably just because he thought it was fun decoration. He wasn't thinking beyond, I just want to make a kind of a pretty picture. He put in birds in his interior sketch because Walt needed, of course, to see what the place was going to look like inside. And he wasn't ready for Walt to go, what are you doing? Stop. Like, we can't put birds in here because they're going to poop on the food. And he didn't use that word. And then it was all about, like, I've got to make the boss. I got to evade complete embarrassment right now. So he's like, oh, no, Walt, they're just stuffed birds. And I will have already told a story once you get to that part of my book that Walt was not going to be doing taxidermy anything in his park because they hadn't done that before. And it was just kind of terrifying to Walt, the idea that they're using real animal skins for, say, creatures on the mine train through nature's wonderland. So he was against taxidermy, and then John Hench was like, well, no, they're mechanical birds. And Walt was always transfixed by mechanical anything, toys onward. He had a huge collection of them. And like all of us nerds, the idea of an inanimate object coming to life was transfixing. So it started with, okay, well, we'll just fill this restaurant, this cafe with these birds. And it will not be a show. It's not a musical review. It's kind of in that rainforest. It's in the rainforest cafe vein, which is while you're eating, maybe the birds just tweet across the room. And that's where it started. Because yes, we can do birds. Yes, they're already working for another show we're working on. But if the birds can work, what else might we have come to life? And it kept growing and growing and growing and getting sillier and more audacious as it went, until one day Walt was like, this is too good. Every time these guys proved that they could do this thing, Walt is transfixed. Walt is having so much fun. The amount of fun Walt had with this thing, seeing it grow, it cannot be understated. So it just kept growing.
The Lowdown on the Plus Up is a Boardwalk Times podcast. At boardwalktimes.net, you'll find some of the most well-considered and insightful writing about the Walt Disney Company, Disney history, and the universe of theme parks available anywhere. Come join us at boardwalktimes.net.
So it just kept growing, and Walt couldn't stop. Like, he was like a kid in a candy store. He could hardly wait, like Steve Jobs, to hold up this iPhone for the first time.
Right.
And like Steve Jobs, was absolutely focused on the idea of this is going to blow people's minds, because it's blowing his mind.
Right.
So it grew and grew and grew. The story of how it became went from a restaurant to a show is not just because Walt thought no one would be able to eat anything in there because they'd be too mesmerized.
Right.
But it was also predicated on the idea that he was having not a good relationship with the Stouffer's company, who had already started the first of 3 restaurants that they were right next to each other that they were going to sponsor. So Walt was ready to get out from under that. And I think the first idea was Vernon Stouffer's group is not working out. It's a horrible, horrible arrangement for us. Well, if it's not working out, do I need them at any, I'm going to be getting rid of them. So who's going to take over the Tiki Room? No one needs to take over the Tiki Room. I think this can stand on its own. So once that decision was made, it was still a happening. It was not a show. It didn't have MCs. It didn't have an opening number. It didn't have words to some of the songs. It didn't have jokes. It did have a 3-act structure, but it was just weird. It was scary. It was surreal and weird and frightening. It's like we need to make it into a show. And once we sell the idea from the very beginning of this thing with an opening number that hadn't been written, that this is a lot of fun, then people will have fun. And they did. Yeah. So just the story of how it evolved, but then it was always evolving, but how it became something else. Yeah. It was meant to be one thing, and then it became something else.
You mentioned the evolution of going from potentially live birds, the mention of a live bird to taxidermy to mechanical birds. I have something here from my collection that I wanted to share with you guys. There's talk always about Walt handing out a group of these to the Imagineers saying, play around with these, see what you can do with it. So I have one here.
Yeah.
And it's one of these Swiss-made, for some reason there you go. It's a Swiss-made bird in a little cage. Yeah. He's made of wood and twine and little feathers attached to him. And so, I'm not sure if we're doing anything visual with this particular show, but for audio, who
is the manufacturer?
The manufacturer, there is not a manufacturer's mark on this, but you tell us if you know.
It might be a Bantam's bird, and that's part of the mythology I break down from page 1 is that bird didn't inspire the Tiki Room. It certainly played a role in inspiring the early Imagineers in their quest for animatronics, for sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then there's also the kind of like, and Walt buys an antique. Well, the Bantam's company made those all the way through the 1960s, so it might not have been an antique.
Yeah,
but it's still that technology has not changed since 78. And it's great. Yeah, it's charming. I want one.
Yeah, it's really sweet. So I'll try and get this close to my mic so that our listeners can hear it. But
that's lovely.
And he chirps away, and he moves his little tail in tune with it, and his head moves left to right, and the beak still opens. Yeah. This one is actually from the 1950s, based upon what.
Yeah.
So this is not like an old antique one, but this is very much a much later one. But
it's still the same technology that dates back to
leather and paper and wood. That's it, and brass works. That's it.
And the bellows.
Yeah, and
my understanding too is that when you wind it up, it doesn't just. Well, I don't know about that one, but the Bantam's bird, the birds that Walt bought had you wind them up, but they had a mechanism in that could stop it and start it over 45 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
So you start it and it stops, but it'll come back to life later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one has it. There's a little lever here that if you rotate it to the center, it will do that timed bit. So every once in a while, I'll think. You'll put it back in its bell jar. You think it's done. Yeah. And she'll start singing again. It's like, shut up, you stupid. It's doing it now. So there you go. So anyway, I thought you guys might have a fun little bit with that.
Yeah. I want one. It's on my list.
I think I don't remember if it was in your book, Ken, or if you just told me that, maybe both, that Walt was handing those out all over the place.
Yeah, there's always, and everybody got a stab at it. And it's like, okay, so he buys this gift for his wife, and then he hands it off to other people to take apart. No, he bought a lot of them. From all sorts of places. They were selling those at Knott's Berry Farm. I'm sure he picked up 3 of them. He had 2 or 3 in his office. So I'm sure one of them he handed off to his people, and he handed them off to more than one person. One of them, your dear friend Lee Adams, who apparently has told the world that he is the father of animatronics. I would give that title to both Roger Broggie and Wathel Rogers. Wathel Rogers is the guy that was tasked with the impossible. Can you imagine a guy who just likes some mechanical toys and builds them in his spare time, but he's in the animation department, and Walt says, I've got some jobs for you. And with a later one being, I need to do a restaurant full of animated birds. And Wathel was like, I sure, Walt, I guess because you believe in me, but then is able to, after having a mini stroke on his way home, gets to it and figures this stuff out. Yeah, and does it. For engineers, and I'm going to call them engineers. My dad was an engineer. Yeah. The art of the impossible, figuring out how to do something that has never been done before. And that's Wathel through and through. Yeah, but they immediately go to the old school. Like, I have to start somewhere. So old school is that bird. And so he digs into it and figures out how it works. And the first sort of exploration of animatronics is probably this 9-inch dancing figure that was for a completely different project that Walt was playing with on his spare time.
Was that the little dancing man?
Animated dioramas, his dancing man for a little vaudeville set. That's a whole other story. But yeah, that's when the bird was brought out and said, take a look at this. This dates back till whenever. But Walt knew that we can't do this, but at least start with it. Like, take a look and from there, I know you guys can do something better. So get to it. I believe in you. And that's all they needed, and they did amazing things. So Lee Adams was in the sound department, so he was more linked to how sound could trigger movement.
He was an electrical engineer.
Yeah.
I and the only reason, I saw the same things you saw about Lee Adams, where he seems to have popped up in like Wikipedia articles and things, and he's long gone.
And that is the first few hurdles of writing this book, is sorting through endless mythology.
Yeah.
For some strange reason in the Disney universe, some fanboy or girl starts a story that is so enchanting, and it just is retold so often that people just buy it. And that Antique Bird is one. There's so many others, but one of them was about the Barker bird outside the TV room, and there's a lot of baloney associated with that. But there's so much mythology, and I argue constantly. Sure, that story is cute, but it's absolutely misleading. And if you dig into the truth, it's a lot more complicated, but it's a lot more
interesting,
rewarding.
Yeah, agreed. We've run into that actually doing this podcast quite a bit, and interestingly enough, I think the Lee Adams thing was a bit of a spanking for me, where I just took people's word and I was like, "Oh, this must be true," and then
you too. Yeah.
Right, and then I started looking and was like, "No, this doesn't seem to be true." And so as we moved forward, as we were looking into stuff, I started questioning a lot more, and had the same effect. I started to realize, oh dear, a lot of these things are not true at all. Yeah. And if you can't get back to, if not the source, at least one person away from the source, it's unlikely to be true, the thing you're reading.
And don't always trust the source. Arthur Goff was a shameless fibber.
Yeah.
And Walt was a raconteur, and he liked a good story,
Yeah.
When Walt was asked, where did you come up with the idea for Disneyland, or why do you want a park? The actual answer is, I don't know.
Yeah.
The actual honest to God truth is, I just wanted one. So Walt struggled with a constant press going, well, tell us the story of how Walt, whatever. And then he didn't invent, but he did tell the story of how he'd sit in front of a carousel and think about a park where you it's in front of a carousel at Griffith Park. And that is probably true.
He probably
did sit there. That doesn't mean that while he sat on that bench, he came up with the idea for Disneyland. He had wanted it since he was, in his 30s, maybe even earlier. For no other reason than I just think it would be cool. I think it would be great. Because I can. Yeah. If you really want to, and now, what do? We go to the Disney Family Museum, and we go to whatever, and they always have a park bench from Griffith Park. Yeah. Mythologizing Walt's dreaming of Disneyland, and if they really want to do it right, they should find his, shower stall from his, from his early home, and put that out there, because that's probably where he did more thinking about Disneyland
than anything else,
than anywhere else.
We did some looking into, because we were talking about the Main Street Electrical Parade, and so we did some looking into Electric Park in Chicago. Yeah. As you look into it and you see what was there, you kind of go, hey, a lot of this looks like Disneyland.
Yeah,
and so, if you really want to see an origin story, that's a pretty good one too.
That's a good start too. Yeah. And he would peek into that park. We always, I love the idea of like we always pine for that which we don't really get enough of as a child.
Yeah.
And the electric park was one of them. He did get to go to electric park, but early all he could do was look in because his family couldn't afford entry. And that was when the idea of electric light bulbs was relatively new. So just seeing one electric light bulb was magic to a kid. Right. Imagine now 1,000 dotting a building at the end of a rail track line. And how mesmerizing for a kid and magical that is for a kid.
Oh, yeah.
So the idea of I can't get in, and so as an adult, you become, it links perfectly with I'm going to have my own Main Street, and it's going to be lined with more light bulbs than you can imagine. Yeah. And it's going to be as mesmerizing today as it was then. Well, the Tiki Room, the very Tiki Room, the idea, Tiki Room really is a toy shop come to life. Yeah. Walt loved mechanical toys like crazy. And as a kid, what happens is his father doesn't believe in their value in any way, shape, or form for the development of a kid. You don't get any toys. Yeah. But while Walt is out as a kid running the newspaper route, he sees toys on people's stoops, and he gets off his bike and plays with these toys right there on the stoop as the sun is coming up. Yeah. And then just as the sun comes up, he hops back on his bike and finishes the route. That is so telling because again, it's what they don't get as a kid that when they become an adult, they go nuts. Yeah, and collect every last bit. I have a similar story. Like I would have loved to have gone to the theater all the time as a kid, and we would see commercials for whatever Avita, and I never went. But what happens as an adult? I become someone who goes to the theater every week. It seems because I'm catching up for lost childhood or lost wants as a child. It's kind of a nerd thing.
It's almost a fetishization of the thing that you couldn't have when you were young.
And Disneyland is a fetishization of the things that Walt revered and felt like he lost in a way that he wants back. Yeah, absolutely. The thing that I say, I think in the very introduction is if Main Street is an evocation of Walt's nostalgia for his childhood, the Tiki Room is an evocation of that very child. That is Walt's toys come to life. And it tracks with Walt's enthusiasm for that project and it tracks with his constantly bringing in VIPs into that room, both when it was a mock-up and both when it was at Disneyland, where it was just him and whoever, Julie Andrews or Tommy Steele or whoever, just them in the room and him just clicking his fingers and wait and thinking, wait, do you see this? And he was like that proud papa. He called that thing his baby. Yeah. And did he, as I understand it, WED owned the train, and did it also own the Tiki Room? Is that why there was a separate admission to the Tiki Room? It was his company, and for many different reasons, his personal think tank. He loved it, and much of it was related to it being a great tax break. People making Walt's income were taxed 50% of their income. So a tax haven was to create your own business and then write off a lot of stuff. So that was part of it. But so WED was its own company because basically everybody other than Walt believed in the Disneyland project. Everybody thought he was nuts and had every good reason to believe he was nuts. Sure. But Walt didn't believe in it, so the only way he could move forward was to create his own company. And the Tiki Room was his own money. WED owned technology and design and all that stuff. So he did have to lease out the building at Disneyland to do it. But the early days of Disneyland, because Stouffer's was no longer aligned with the project, you had to buy a separate ticket to go into the Tiki Room.
Yeah.
Right there at the building. No one seemed to know who were buying. Like, why am I buying a separate ticket? Blah, blah, blah. There's a whole other. But they did. That was to keep the book separate so that the money going to the Tiki Room could cleanly go back to Wed Enterprises. That eventually was worked out. I don't know, 5 years later. I don't know, 3 years later. I forget.
As I recall, like similarly with the railroad, I think Wed had to pay
that remained Walt's property for much longer.
Yeah, and they had to pay right of way to the park for a long time, which was very strange. So let me jump off this track a little bit and ask. So how does Ken Bruce, who is a storyboard artist for a lot of big films,
a survivor of John Kricfalusi. I teach animation, so it's like I've interviewed a lot of people there. So,
so how does he end up going? You know what I want to do is I want to write a book about the history of the Enchanted Tiki Room. How did you get to that point?
I think the first thing to mention is that this was the book I wanted to read my entire, almost my entire life.
Yeah.
I really, really wanted to read a deep dive. I didn't want a coffee table book. I wanted a deep dive into this because I always knew how consequential it was and how important it was to the history of the park. And no one had written it. Yeah. That didn't mean that I thought I was the one to write it. But what happened is I'm at Pixar. I'm at a backyard luau at Pete Docter's house. And Pete Docter says, Ken, I want you to meet someone. Well, it was two people, Kevin Kidney and his partner, Jody Daly. And they're big names in the Disney collectibles. And they just finished a project doing the costumes for the New Country Bear. And they've done parade floats and restorations and just amazing work. Anyway, so I meet Kevin, and Kevin is, like me, totally fixated with old school Disneyland. Yeah. Kind of Walt era Disneyland and that all that history. And he, as a side note, he goes, he worked at the park. He worked as a cast member when he was younger at both the Tiki Room and the Treehouse. Yeah. And the Jungle Cruise. You just rotated. So so he loved all of that. And, for a good chunk of his life, he was always grabbing anything that wasn't tied down that was related to the Tiki Room. But he had a great collection. And he goes, Ken, now that I know you're as much a nerd over the Tiki Room as I am, I have a collection of stuff on CD-ROM, pictures and whatever. And I'd be happy to share that with you. And he said, as an aside, it's nice to know that someone is as interested in this as I am and that I can share this with you. And I don't know what use this is to anybody else unless, I guess, they were to write a book. And that was when the earth shook. Because I immediately thought that's the book I always wanted to read. Yeah. And I thought, holy cow, I guess it's me. If it's a book you want to read and you're just handed kind of the tip of the iceberg, I always say there's plenty of other tons, I was going to say S-loads of research. Of course, I had to do over 10 years, 16 years actually. But that was a great start. That was that was like the great trunk, and everything could branch off of that. After mulling it through and really, really thinking, can I do this? I was like, yeah, I can do this. And I guess I did. And again, it was 10 years of formatting and researching and 6 years of writing after that. So 16 years, that was a 16-year project. So when people say, what's your next book? I'm like, hey, that's it.
Yeah, I did it.
I'm done. That's my masterpiece. Have at it. But boy, did I quickly find out that it was the book that it was a book worth writing. I think the Tiki Room is a pop culture masterwork. I think it's a work of art. I think it should be, they always say Disneyland is not a museum. And yet the Tiki Room has earned a place in one. It's that important. So, I marched forward with writing that book because I felt like I was the only one Who else?
Passionate enough, crazy enough.
Yeah, who knows? I don't know how I kept the fire under my hiney to do it, but I marched forward. When you tell enough people you're going to do something, I guess you better do it, because it's very, very embarrassing if you don't. So I just kept marching forward. My deadline was the 60th anniversary, and I pretty much made it. I was happy about that I did it, and it is a really great story. It just became more interesting as I went. Yeah,
yeah, and what you've done is not only have you given a great history of the tiki room itself, and not only have you given a great history of American tiki culture, you've given a great history of audio animatronics.
Yeah.
In fact, I can't think of any other example that has gone in as much depth about the history of audio animatronics. Yeah. Like, I thought I had a pretty good handle on this stuff, and I didn't. I know much, much more now from having read the book.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not an electrician or a machinist or an engineer, but I was like, I'm going to have to find a way to explain this to someone like me in a way that I go, oh, okay, I get that. Animatronics has gotten insanely, especially with computer tech, so complicated and complex. But it starts with some rudimentary, problems to solve, and so I dig into them. And that was one of the things that was interesting too. Yeah. Even though this is old school tech, and that bird you put up is also very old school. Mm-hmm. When you actually dig in, it is no less genius.
Yeah.
No less. Yes, we have moved on to much more sophisticated ways of moving, three-dimensional figures. But knowing the time and the era and the problems that they had to solve, how they did it was utterly ingenious, and it still is astounding to me. Very, again, clunky and old school as all heck in 2025, mm-hmm. but again, absolutely no less fascinating and magical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They took the tools that they had, and they went further than anyone could have dreamed they could have gone.
They solved problems that had really never quite been solved.
Yeah.
While borrowing from the Defense Department.
I had always wondered, because I had heard those clips of Walt saying, "Oh, we use the same technology as the Polaris submarine fleet." And I was like, "What does that mean?"
And that was my job too, because I was exactly the same in the same boat, Kelly. I was like, "What are you talking about?" So I had to figure that out.
Yeah.
And when I did, it was like, that was so great, because I felt like I'd stumbled upon the Holy Grail. Like, I had always like, what's the Polaris missile, and what what specifically are you taking, and blah, and how did this happen? Like, and when I finally kind of hit upon the answer, I was like, oh wow,
yeah,
like, I'm so happy I figured that out.
I'm so happy you did too, because I'd always wondered.
Well, there's two things that come to my mind right off the bat, which is, one, it wasn't lost on people in the 1960s that the Tiki Room was using hardware that was essentially meant to kill people for joy, for cultivating joy.
Yeah.
A bit ironic, and I forget what the other thing was I'm going to say. That Walt wasn't taking stuff that they were necessarily using. They had already like, the Defense Department had already started to figure out brand new ways of doing what that old tech was doing. So when Walt's people stumbled upon that stuff, the Defense Department was like, "Yeah, have that. It's no longer a secret. We're doing something else.
Yeah, you can have it for cheap.
Sale. You can have it for cheap. Yeah. But even then, the amount of research and development they did, Walt was very clear. It was like, we couldn't have done this without their research and development and all that / money. Walt always was talking about how much something cost. He would get on his TV show and, this cost more money than we should have paid, but
but we're ready to build now. Well, let me ask, kind of as we sort of draw this to a close. So I was.
Oh dang! We have to go.
We don't have to. We can talk forever. So I was at the Walt Disney Family Museum. Pete was there. My wife was there. And I got in a conversation with the guy who I think is the guy that runs the gift shop there, where your book is proudly displayed. You can get,
which was a political challenge.
Yeah. I asked him at one point, I was like, how does someone get a book in here? And he's like, oh, basically this person in the hierarchy of the museum has to have read it and decided they liked it. And I'm like, well, what are the odds? Yeah. But so I had to get Pixar to knock on a few walls. And I had to get a lovely woman who, Marcy Carricker Smothers, who wrote a couple great books. She has been such a great ally, and there's a story. There's a story between me and her that is worthy of being told, but I won't tell it now. But she was a great rival, and she knows everybody at the museum. So she knocked down a few walls as well. God bless her. And so it is not. And even then, when I was like, can you guys take a picture of my book there? Because it's so thrilling that it's there. Like, I'm so honored. And they're like, yes, you can, but don't post it on social media, because before you do that, we have to go through a legion of lawyers to make sure that that's all right, because everything is tricky over there. And I still haven't succeeded. I haven't gotten the word back on whether I can even take the picture, say that you took, and proudly post that anywhere. So it's a problem, and I get it. They are there to protect the sanctity of Walt, and so you have to. There's a lot of cross checking that they have to do. Yeah. So I was talking to the guy at the shop, and I said, "Hey, have you checked this out? This is a great book." And he said, "Really? Can you tell me, like, just a short thing that I can use to tell people about it? Like, what's exciting that you can give me in kind of a soundbite?" Yeah. So I'm going to ask you, I'll tell you what I told him, but I was curious, if someone asked you that question, what would you say?
It's a good one. I think I was on an earlier podcast, and all of a sudden I found my mouth making noises. But I think it was a good link. And that is, what if an attraction at a theme park went from a fun little attraction to a verifiable work of pop art? Yeah. What happens when something that was meant to be maybe ephemeral turns into something profoundly consequential and artful? Like, I do equate the Tiki Room, Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, with a very personal piece of pop culture that is a wonder of the world, quite frankly. Yeah. So what happens? How do you manage that in a park that has to remain relevant? It's that important. The history of that it is that important, and what it remains to this day is that important. So I that's a lot of words, but it's basically that. It's that what if, you stumbled upon that. Thank you, Marty Sklar, because he would always run around saying, please, guys, you can't fetishize these things at the park. Walt wanted this park to change. This park is not a museum. Right. And yet the frustrating thing is, attention needs to be paid to the Enchanted Tiki Room as something much more important than just a lightweight musical review with a bunch of birds. It's made its mark on culture, and it's kind of weirdly sacred. Sacred is a word that I hesitate to use, but I have to. Yeah, it's that important. It's because it's so important. It's so personal to Walt. Yeah, so personal. It is kind of the last little vestiges at his original park that is such a reflection of his interests and his personality.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. I think that, I've had discussions with people, and this is a longer discussion we probably don't want to get into right now, but I've had discussions with people about what is Disneyland, and I know that sounds broad and a little cheesy, but it's like and so what is the essence of Disney being Disney?
Yeah,
and in that sense, I think things like the Tiki Room are incredibly significant.
Yeah.
And things should
bring up. Yeah, I think of I got to remember an early viewing of the Tiki Room, and an animator friend of mine was like, "God, that was charming," and I'm like, "We don't use the word charm that much, probably because it feels a little icky, but it's not a bad word, and it fits. It absolutely fits. The show was absolutely charming, and I think what ultimately that show sells, that I think Disneyland overall has tried to sell." Or should continue to try to sell, is just a simple sense of joy. It's about joy.
Yeah.
It's about joy. Universal, Universal knows what it is. It's about, it's got a completely different tone, and it should embrace it. And
Disney should embrace
Disney. And Disney has, and Disney striving to be cool and hip is not a good idea.
No,
because it never was cool or hip, and that was its charm.
Yeah,
its charm was its corniness, and it's just embracing, again, joy. And that is a good thing. That is a perfectly admirable thing.
I think there was a quote from Rolly Crump once where he had gone back to Disneyland in like the 90s or the 2000s, and he was pretty disparaging, and he said, Disneyland used to freaking reach out and hug you.
Yeah.
And I know what he's talking about there.
He was also talking about how the park is intimate in size too. And so because all the foliage has grown in, you go to Disney World, and everything is. Yeah. Every street is 3 times wider. He would talk about the Disneyland that hugged you because it was an intimate place.
Yeah,
a place that there was lots of things to discover, just by turning around a corner.
Well, I think this is a pretty good place to draw to a close. So, Ken Bruce, tell folks how they can find your book, because they should read it.
Oh, I think they should too. Don't buy the book because of me. Buy it because it is a great story that I think is riveting and full of surprises and full of twists and turns. It almost plays out like a mystery novel in a way. And when I wrote it, I was like, God, this is playing out like a movie with cliffhangers, for God's sake.
What luck.
Buy the book because it's such a great story, and such a kind of a look, I think, at people have told me and I'll get to the idea that what I think might be fresh about this too is that this is a peek at Walt, the creator, the guy who's absolutely in the thick of building something from the ground up that is very personal. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't help but tell that story through the lens of someone who is in that world of people building things from the ground up. So I think that is a unique take on Walt that hasn't really been seen very much. So where can you buy it? Amazon is the place to buy it. That's the easiest place. I'm still working on the brick and mortar stuff. So if you do go to the Disney Family Museum, there's copies there, which is super exciting. So Amazon is a good place. I can also send. You can also go to my website, which is very easy to remember, tikiroom63.com, and there you can I can also send you a copy of the book there, or an autographed copy as well. Yeah, personalized directly to you because I have nothing better to do.
Which you kindly did for me, and I appreciate very much.
Oh, absolutely! It's so funny. A side note: I just automatically personalized it to whoever bought the book, and I do that with everyone. But there was a kind of a not very happy woman who was like, "I'm very upset because I bought an autographed book, but I bought it for my whatever son-in-law. Yeah, and you made it out to me, and this makes me very upset." how can you fix this? And I was like, well,
whiteout?
Whiteout. I mean, I said I'll give you a discount book, but we're both kind of in the wrong here. But I've since actually got the website and clearly wrote in bold, if you, basically like if you want it made out to anybody else, you got to tell me.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you can get a copy. So both those places. Amazon is going to be the easiest place to nab it. But again, don't buy it for any other reason than it's a great story. It's a great piece of history, and I think it's a really fun story. I think.
I absolutely concur. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Ken Bruce, thank you so much for doing
you,
this.
Kelly.
Thank what you, a Peter. Pleasure.
I'm so glad we finally touched base, and I'm so happy that I don't know that I'm linked to you, Peter, on Facebook, but I know I've got Kelly in there, and he always feels like a family member. So
I'm allowed.
If I'm literally like, I wonder how Kelly is doing after his operation, then there's some history between us now.
Yeah, no, you actually reached out. I really appreciated that.
I was like, I know Kelly now. Kelly's a buddy now, whether he wants to be or not.
I'm totally in.
So thank you guys. Thank you so much for having me. I know you're breaking precedent by having someone other than yourselves on. Yeah, and keep marching forward with your absolutely great podcast.
Thank you. Very kind.
Keep doing it. You're doing great.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Lowdown on the Plus Up. If you have, please tell your friends where you found us. And if you haven't, we can pretend this never happened and need not speak of it again. For a lot more thoughts on theme parks and related stuff, check out my writing for Boardwalk Times at boardwalktimes.net. Feel free to reach out to Pete and I on our Lowdown on the Plus Up Facebook group, or send us a message directly at comments@lowdown-plus-up.com. We really want to hear about how you'd plus these attractions up and read some of your ideas on the show. Our theme music is Goblin, Tinker, Soldier, Spy by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. We'll have a new episode out real soon. Why? Because we like you.
Amigos down there, it is me up here. Amigos, Romans, and Disneylanders. Stop walking while I'm squawking. Caramba, we have something really big for you today. It is the world premiere of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. It is Disney entertainment at its most exciting, best kind. You wait for the show right here below me in the Magic Garden where the gods and goddesses perform. Get your tickets right over here for Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. This has been a recording.